What would drive a father to betray his own son in the most unthinkable way? Was it greed, fear, or something far darker, buried beneath years of secrets? At just 14 years old, Ethan Carter's world shattered the moment he realized the man who raised him wanted him dead. Left to perish in a cabin engulfed in flames, he did what no one thought possible. He escaped. But survival came at a cost, because in the ashes of his past, he uncovered something his father had been hiding, something worth killing for. Dear family, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to support us and stay for this powerful story. Now let's begin. A father's rules are meant to be followed. They exist for a reason, carved into the very foundation of a boy's world. But sometimes rules are not meant to protect. Sometimes they are meant to hide something terrifying. The cold wind snaked through the towering pines, whispering through the frozen Montana wilderness. Ethan Carter, just 14, pulled his coat tighter against the creeping chill, his breath rising in pale clouds as he carried an armful of firewood back toward the cabin. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The air smelled of pine and distant wood smoke, the kind of scent that had always meant home. But tonight, something felt different. His father, James Carter, was a man of few words. He was not cruel, but he was unyielding, a man who believed in discipline, in survival, in silence. He had raised Ethan alone, teaching him to track, to hunt, to navigate the land as if he were part of it. But no lesson had ever been repeated as often, or as forcefully, as the one about the shed. That shed is off limits. Never go near it. Never ask why. For as long as Ethan could remember, the small weathered structure had stood there, just beyond the cabin, half swallowed by the trees. It was nothing special at first glance, just an old wooden shed, its slanted roof sagging slightly from years of winter snow. But unlike everything else on their land, it had always been locked. His father never locked the house, never locked the rifles, never locked the truck, only the shed. That was why Ethan's steps faltered when he passed by and saw the door hanging slightly open. His pulse kicked up. He shifted the firewood in his arms, suddenly unsure if he was seeing things. The door had never been opened before. Not once. A gust of wind whistled through the trees, nudging the door slightly, causing it to creak against the hinges. Ethan swallowed hard. Had his father forgotten to lock it? Number impossible. James Carter never forgot anything. A strange unease prickled at the back of his neck. He glanced toward the trail that led into the woods. His father had left at dawn, rifle slung over his shoulder, heading toward the ridge to track elk. He wouldn't be back for hours. Ethan hesitated. He could walk away, pretend he never saw it. But something in the pit of his stomach urged him forward. He took a slow step toward the shed, then another. The closer he got, the heavier the air felt, thick with something unspoken. He reached out and placed his fingers against the rough wood, feeling the grain beneath his touch. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, untouched, carrying the scent of dust, oil, and something metallic. Sunlight streamed through a small, grime-covered window, illuminating shelves stacked with rusted tools, old equipment, and crates. Ethan stepped inside, his boots stirring up dust from the wooden floor. His father had always guarded this place. But why? It was just old junk, wasn't it? His eyes scanned the dim interior. And then, in the corner, he saw the crate. It was different from the others. Smaller, older, shoved beneath a workbench as if someone had tried to hide it. A tarp covered most of it, but one side peeked out, the wood rough with age. Ethan's breath hitched. He crouched down, hesitating for only a second before pulling the tarp away. Beneath it lay an old hand-drawn map. His brows knitted together as he carefully unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had faded, but he could still make out a rough sketch of the land, with markings leading into the deep woods. An X. Beside it, tucked neatly away, was a rusty pickaxe and a shovel, their handles worn smooth. His stomach twisted. Something had been buried. A noise snapped him back to reality, a footstep outside. Ethan barely had time to react before a dark figure filled the doorway. His father. James Carter stood motionless, his breath heavy in the freezing air. His silhouette was backlit by the setting sun, casting his face into shadow. But Ethan didn't need to see his expression to feel the weight of it. James wasn't just angry, he was furious. "I told you!" His voice was dangerously quiet, each word slow and deliberate. "To stay out of here." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but he didn't get the chance. James moved first. His father's hand clamped around his collar, yanking him up with terrifying force. Ethan barely had time to grab the mat before he was dragged out, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. The shed door slammed shut behind them, the finality of it ringing through the clearing. Ethan had never been afraid of his father. Frustrated with him? Yes. Annoyed? Often. But afraid? Never. But tonight, as he stared up at James Carter's rigid face, his clenched jaw, his white-knuckled fists, Ethan knew, for the first time in his life, that his father wasn't just a hard man, he was a man with a secret, and Ethan had just gotten too close to finding out what it was. The winter air had a sharpness to it that night, cutting through the Montana wilderness like a blade. The sky stretched above in an endless canvas of ink, speckled with stars, their cold light barely touching the thick forest below. Snow crunched beneath their boots as Ethan Carter followed his father down the narrow, winding path. He had walked this trail before, many times, but never under such uneasy silence. James Carter had barely spoken a word since dinner. There had been no mention of why they were leaving the cabin so late, why Ethan needed to bundle up in his thickest coat, why his father's rifle, normally slung over his shoulder, was missing tonight. "We need to check on something," James had said, his voice curt, giving no room for questions. Ethan had learned long ago that pushing his father for answers usually led nowhere. But tonight, the quiet felt different. He could feel it. There was a weight in the air between them, something unspoken pressing down on his chest. The path twisted deeper into the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Ethan glanced up at his father's face, the dim moonlight catching his profile. Jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead, shoulders tense. Something was wrong. The grip on Ethan's arm tightened, not enough to hurt but firm, as if James was afraid he might run. "Dad?" Ethan's voice came out quieter than he intended, his breath visible in the freezing night air. James didn't answer. Ethan's stomach nodded. His father had always been strict, always been a man of rules, but he had never been cruel. Yet tonight, there was something different about him, something colder. They walked for what felt like miles, but Ethan knew the distance well. It wasn't far. Soon through the skeletal trees, he saw it, the old hunting cabin. It was small, nearly forgotten by time, its wooden frame weathered by harsh winters and long, lonely seasons. His father had built it years ago, used it now and then during hunting trips, but lately it had stood abandoned. So why were they here now? James stepped forward, pulling Ethan along with him. The wooden porch groaned beneath their weight as they stopped before the door. Ethan glanced around, heart pounding. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been here in weeks. "Dad, why are we—" The words barely left his mouth before James's hands were on him. The shove came without warning, a single, forceful movement that sent Ethan stumbling backward into the cabin. His boot caught on the uneven wooden floor, and he fell hard, landing on his hands and knees. The door slammed shut before he could react. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent his pulse racing. Ethan scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the door, his palms slapping against the rough wood. He pushed, pulled. The handle wouldn't budge. Locked. His breath came in fast, sharp bursts. "Dad!" He pounded against the door. "Dad, what are you doing? Let me out." No answer, only silence. Panic clawed its way into Ethan's chest. He slammed his fist harder, his voice rising. "This isn't funny. Open the door." Still, nothing. Ethan's fingers curled into fists as he tried to steady his breathing. This had to be some kind of test. A lesson in survival, a punishment for the shed, something. Anything but what his gut was whispering to him. Something much worse. His father wouldn't leave him out here, would he? A movement outside caught his attention, a flicker of light through the cracks in the wooden walls. Ethan's body went rigid. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sharp strike of a match. A pause. Then, the whoosh of fire catching dry wood. Ethan's breath hitched. The glow outside brightened. The air shifted, carrying the first traces of smoke through the gaps in the walls. "No!" His voice barely came out. He rushed back to the door, throwing his full weight against it. "Dad, stop! What are you doing?" The flames outside crackled, stretching toward the cabin like hungry hands. Ethan's fists pounded the wood, desperation clawing at his throat. "Dad, please!" But outside, beyond the rising fire, his father was already walking away. The first tendrils of smoke curled through the cracks in the wooden walls, creeping into the cabin like living things. Ethan Carter stumbled back from the door, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. The smell hit him next. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Wood burning. Fire. Outside, the faint glow deepened into a hungry orange, flickering against the gaps in the planks, shadows dancing wildly across the cabin's dim interior. The flames had caught. A wave of raw terror crashed into Ethan's chest. "No! No! No! No!" His hands shot to the door again, wrenching the handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his fists against the wood, the impact jarring up to his shoulders. "Dad, please!" His voice cracked, choked with disbelief. "Don't do this!" The fire outside crackled louder, feeding on the dry logs stacked against the walls. Smoke thickened, slithering in through every crevice. The heat followed, a slow, suffocating wave pressing against his skin, his breath turning shallow. He staggered back, coughing as the air around him thickened. His lungs burned, each inhale like swallowing fire. He forced himself to the window, the small pane now glowing with the light of the inferno outside. And then he saw him, James Carter, walking away. Not running, not hesitating, just walking, his broad shoulders rigid, his stride steady. The fire raged behind him, climbing the cabin walls like eager fingers, reflecting off his silhouette. Ethan's breath stuttered. His father wasn't coming back. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. The betrayal struck like a physical blow, worse than the smoke burning his throat, worse than the heat pressing in. His father, the man who had raised him, who had taught him how to track, how to build, how to survive, had lit the match and walked away. A sob wrenched itself from Ethan's chest, but fear quickly overtook heartbreak. Because now he wasn't just a son left behind. He was a boy about to burn alive. The fire was alive. It roared and hissed as it devoured the cabin, flames twisting and clawing their way up the wooden walls, turning everything in their path into burning embers. The air had changed. It wasn't just thick with smoke now. It was heavy, suffocating, stealing the oxygen from his lungs before he could even gasp for breath. Ethan Carter staggered backward, one hand clutching his throat as violent coughs racked his body. His eyes burned, the acrid smoke searing them shut before he forced them open again. He couldn't see past the growing haze, couldn't tell where the fire had spread the fastest, but he could feel it. The walls around him were heating up, the wooden beams above groaning, splitting, their cracking sounds barely audible over the roaring inferno. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. If he didn't move, if he didn't get out right now, he wouldn't get out at all. Desperation surged through him. He lunged toward the window, his fingers scrabbling at the wooden ledge as he peered outside. The glass was thick, old, warped from years of exposure to the elements. It was small, too small for him to climb through even if it did break, but it was his only shot. Ethan spun, searching wildly, his gaze locking onto an old wooden chair by the corner. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed it with both hands, his arms shaking, every muscle tensed with fear and adrenaline. With a guttural cry, he swung it forward. The impact sent a tremor up his arms, rattling his bones. But the glass didn't break. Ethan sucked in a breath, barely able to fill his lungs before he swung again. And again, crack, crack. But the window held, only small fractures forming along its edges, mocking him. "No, no, no!" His voice came out hoarse, raw from the smoke, from the betrayal, from the sheer terror of knowing the fire was winning. A sudden wave of heat hit him, like an invisible force pushing him back. He whirled around. The flames had reached the far wall now, licking hungrily at the wooden panels, crawling toward the ceiling. The room was collapsing in on itself. The fire was too fast. His mind screamed at him to find another way. Think. And then he saw it. The back wall. The flames hadn't fully reached it yet, but the heat had already done its damage. The wood had started to warp and split, its surface cracking, peeling like dried paper. A few planks had pulled away from their nails, revealing dark gaps beneath. A weakness, a chance. Ethan didn't think. He ran. With every ounce of strength left in his body, he threw himself against the wall. His shoulder slammed into the weakening wood, sending a dull, sickening jolt through his bones. He gritted his teeth and did it again. The structure groaned in protest, but it didn't give. The fire was closing in now. His skin stung, his clothes sticking to him with sweat, smoke, and fear. His breath came in ragged gas as he stepped back, planting his feet firmly before launching forward once more. Everything he had, everything he was, went into that final push. A deafening crack split through the air. The wood gave way. Ethan fell forward, tumbling through the jagged opening as debris rained down behind him. His body hit the cold, hard earth outside, but he barely felt it. Because for the first time since the fire began, he could breathe. The cold hit him like a slap. Ethan Carter tumbled forward, crashing onto the frozen ground, his hands sinking into damp earth. His chest convulsed as he coughed violently, his body desperate to expel the thick smoke that clung to his lungs. His vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges. Every breath was a struggle, every movement sluggish, as if the fire had stolen more than just the air from his body. It had stolen his strength, but he was alive. The realization struck him hard, almost as jarring as the ice beneath his palms. He was alive. A monstrous roar erupted behind him. Ethan jerked his head up, blinking through the blur of sweat and soot. The cabin, his prison, his home, his near grave, was now a writhing inferno. Flames curling into the sky like the grasping fingers of something alive, something hungry. The wooden beams groaned and cracked as the fire tore through them, sending glowing embers spiraling into the night. He couldn't stay here. Through the chaos of his pounding heart and burning lungs, another thought surged forward, sharp and undeniable. His father might still be close. The weight of that truth sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over him. If James Carter saw him now, crawling out of the fire he was never supposed to escape, he wouldn't hesitate. He would finish what he started. Ethan forced himself onto shaky legs, his muscles screaming in protest. Every inch of him was coated in soot, the smell of smoke and burning wood clinging to his skin. He turned toward the trees, his breath hitching. The forest was pitch black, no light, no path, just a void of tangled branches and endless shadows stretching beyond sight. He swallowed hard. There was no time to think, no time to plan. His father was out there, somewhere. And if Ethan hesitated for even a second, if he so much as looked back, it could all be over. So he ran. The first few steps were unsteady, his legs still weak from the smoke, but fear drove him forward. He plunged into the darkness, his boots crunching against the frost-bitten ground, branches whipping at his arms and face. The cold air burned his lungs, but he welcomed the pain. Pain meant he was still moving. Pain meant he was still alive. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if there was anywhere to go. All he knew was that if he stopped, even for a second, he might not get another chance to run. The forest swallowed him whole. Ethan Carter sprinted through the endless maze of towering pines, his breath ragged, his body screaming for rest. The cold night air slashed at his exposed skin, his clothes still damp with sweat and smoke. Every step was blind, his boots crashing against roots and jagged rocks hidden beneath layers of dead leaves. The forest was merciless. Branches clawed at his face. Thorns tore at his sleeves, but he couldn't stop. He didn't know how long he had been running. Minutes, hours. The fire had long since faded behind him, but the terror still clung to his bones. His father was out there, somewhere in the darkness, maybe watching, maybe hunting. The thought sent another surge of adrenaline through his body. Then the ground disappeared beneath him. For a split second, there was nothing but air. Then, impact. Ethan crashed down hard, his body twisting as he tumbled through open space. His arms flailed, reaching for anything to stop his fall, but his fingers met only dust and air. His body slammed into packed earth, sending a shockwave of pain through his ribs. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't breathe at all. Silence. Dust settled around him in thick, choking clouds, swirling in the dim light that filtered through cracks above. Ethan groaned, rolling onto his side, his entire body aching. He coughed, every inhale sending a sharp stab through his chest. Where was he? Slowly, he forced himself upright, his hands pressing against cool stone. His pulse pounded in his ears as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The air down here was different, stale, untouched, heavy with the weight of time. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a room. Ethan's gaze darted around the confined space. The walls were rough, made of stone and packed earth, the ceiling reinforced with ancient wooden beams that looked like they had been standing for decades. Old crates and sacks lay collapsed in the corners, their contents long forgotten. Then his eyes locked onto something. Against the far wall, half buried in dirt and dust, sat an old wooden chest. His breath caught. It was larger than the others, its surface rough with age. The wood cracked in places from time and moisture. But it wasn't the chest itself that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was the symbol carved into the lid, a wolf's head, its eyes hollow, its jaw slightly open as if frozen mid-snarl. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. He had seen this before. The shed, the map. The same wolf insignia had been drawn in ink, marking something important, something hidden. His father had tried to keep him from that map, from this place. His father had tried to kill him because of this. Ethan crawled forward, his hands shaking as he reached for the chest. His fingers ran over the worn wood, tracing the deep grooves of the wolf's face. His breath came uneven, his mind racing. What was so important that his father was willing to murder his own son to keep it buried? With trembling hands, he pried his fingers beneath the lid and lifted. The hinges groaned in protest, rusted from time and neglect. Dust billowed into the air as the chest cracked open, revealing what lay inside. Ethan's breath stopped. Stacks of gold coins, their surfaces dull but unmistakable. Small bars of gold, each neatly arranged beneath delicate layers of cloth. Antique jewelry, ornate and intricate, glinting even in the weak light. It was real. Ethan stared intently at the chest. Why did his father have this? Where had it come from? His hands trembled as he reached for one of the coins, turning it over between his fingers. It was heavy, old, its surface worn smooth by time. This wasn't something a man like James Carter should have had. His father had never spoken of wealth, never shown any sign of living a life beyond their isolated existence in the woods. So why was he hiding a fortune beneath their land? His pulse pounded in his ears as a sickening thought crept in. Did my father steal this? Kill for it? The weight of the discovery still pressed on Ethan's chest, but he didn't have time to process it. He couldn't stay here. Dust swirled in the stale air, disturbed by his uneven breaths. His fingers tightened around the edge of the open chest, his mind racing. Gold, jewelry, a fortune buried beneath the earth. This was why his father had tried to kill him. But if James Carter thought he had succeeded, he'd be back to check. And if he found Ethan alive, the thought sent a shudder down his spine. He turned in frantic circles, searching for a way out. The pit he had fallen through was too high, the walls too steep. There was no way to climb back up. The only way was forward. Then his eyes caught something. A dark opening at the far end of the bunker. A crawl space. Narrow, low to the ground, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The wooden beams reinforcing it were old, rotting, but still intact. Where did it lead? Did it even have an exit? It didn't matter. He had no choice. Ethan moved quickly, forcing himself onto his hands and knees, the rough stone scraping against his skin. He hesitated for only a second before plunging into the darkness. The walls closed in around him almost immediately. The tunnel was tight, suffocating, the earth pressing in from all sides. With every movement, the cold dirt shifted, loose soil tumbling onto his arms, his face. He clenched his jaw, fighting the instinct to panic. This was his only way out. He crawled forward, his breaths loud in the narrow space, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The passage smelled of damp earth, of old roots tangled through the walls, of time stretching back decades. The deeper he went, the harder it became to breathe. The air was thinning, his elbows and knees ached, scraped raw from the jagged ground. Sweat dripped down his temples despite the cold. He didn't know how long he had been crawling, minutes, an hour, but the passage seemed endless, twisting and winding beneath the land like an ancient vein. Then, just as the weight of the earth around him became unbearable, he saw it, a sliver of pale moonlight. Ethan's breath hitched, an exit. Renewed energy surged through his limbs as he dragged himself forward, pushing past the last stretch of tangled roots and loose stones. The opening was just big enough for him to squeeze through. With a final desperate shove, he emerged. Cold night air hit him like a wave, filling his lungs with a sharp, stinging relief. He collapsed onto damp grass, gasping, his body trembling from exhaustion. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the night sky through the trees. The stars were sharp and distant, the moon casting silver light over the forest. For a moment, all he could do was breathe. Then, a crack in the distance, a snapped twig. Ethan's body went rigid. He wasn't safe yet. His father was still out there, and the hunt wasn't over. The forest stretched endlessly before him, a vast, silent expanse of darkness. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the cold wind and the distant echo of his own unsteady breaths. Ethan Carter trudged forward, his body exhausted, his limbs aching, his mind running in frantic circles. He had no idea how long he had been walking. Hours? A whole night. The moon had shifted in the sky, dipping lower behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted with every step he took. His boots were damp from the dew, his clothes still clinging to him with the stench of smoke and sweat. His throat burned from the fire, from the dust, from the panic that hadn't loosened its grip on him since the moment he realized his father had left him to die. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion. It wasn't even the fear. It was the not knowing. Why did his father have that gold? Where had it come from? What had he done to get it? Ethan had spent his whole life following James Carter's rules. Be strong, be silent, never question. But now every unspoken question screamed inside his head. Who was my father? Who was he before me? And what else has he done? A gust of wind cut through the trees, making him shiver. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, knowing it wouldn't do much against the biting cold. He needed to keep moving. There was no going back. He didn't know how far he had traveled when the trees finally began to thin. The forest opened into a clearing, and beyond it, a lonely stretch of highway stretched into the distance, empty and desolate under the fading moonlight. Ethan's steps faltered as he reached the edge of the road. The asphalt was cracked, worn from time and neglect. No lights, no traffic. Just an endless strip of pavement disappearing into the horizon. He stood there for a long moment, his breath visible in the icy air. Now what? His father had taken everything from him. His home, his sense of safety, even his own name. If James Carter knew he was still alive, he would never stop hunting him. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. Then James Carter would have to hunt a ghost. The faint rumble of an engine pulled him from his thoughts. His head snapped up just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. The vehicle was moving slow, its old engine growling against the silence of the night. Ethan stepped forward, his body tensed, his pulse hammering. His instincts screamed at him to hide, but he knew he couldn't. He needed to get as far away from here as possible. As the truck neared, he raised his hand, a small, hesitant gesture. For a moment, he thought the driver would pass him by. The vehicle rolled forward, tires crunching over loose gravel. Then, with a tired hiss of brakes, it stopped. The door creaked open, and a gruff, weathered voice called out, "You lost, kid?" Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. The driver was an older man, probably in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and a beard that had gone mostly gray. His lined face spoke of years of hard work, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with quiet strength. Ethan could tell he was assessing him, trying to decide whether to drive away or take a risk. "Where are you headed?" the man asked. Ethan hesitated. He didn't know. Anywhere but here. Anywhere his father couldn't find him. "Denver," he said finally, his voice hoarse. The driver's brow furrowed. His gaze flicked over Ethan's soot-streaked face. The torn jacket, the way he stood, half-starved, exhausted, but still ready to run if he had to. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the man exhaled and gestured toward the passenger seat. "All right, get in." Ethan didn't hesitate. He climbed into the truck, the door creaking as he pulled it shut behind him. The warmth of the cabin hit him immediately, the faint scent of gasoline and old leather filling his lungs. The driver shifted the truck into gear, glancing at him once more. "Name's Frank," he said simply. Ethan stared at the road ahead, watching the dark highway stretch out before them. His father's name was still heavy on his tongue, a weight he didn't want to carry anymore. He swallowed hard. "Eli," he said finally. "My name's Eli." Frank nodded as if sensing there was more to the story, but knowing better than to ask. The truck rumbled forward, carrying Ethan, or Eli, into the unknown. And for the first time in his life, he was free. The bus station was colder than he expected. Ethan, Eli, as he now called himself, stood beneath the flickering neon light of a rundown ticket booth, the weight of everything he had lost pressing against his ribs. He had spent his entire life in the deep forests of Montana, living by his father's rules, knowing nothing of the world beyond the trees. And now here he was, a ghost, a boy with no past, a man with no name. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as Eli slid a few crumpled bills across the counter, the last of the ordinary money he had. The real wealth, the stolen gold, was tucked safely into a hidden pouch inside his bag. It was dangerous money, blood money, but it was all he had. "Where to?" the clerk asked, his voice tired. Eli hesitated. He had never been anywhere, never seen beyond the wilderness his father had caged him in. The city names on the schedule board blurred together, meaningless destinations that held no promise. "Farthest ticket you've got," he said finally. The man barely blinked before sliding a ticket under the glass. "Chicago. Bus leaves in 10 minutes. Eli took the ticket, gripping it tighter than necessary. He turned away, walking toward the worn-out bench near the platform. The other passengers barely noticed him. Just another kid with a backpack, another drifter with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. But he had already decided. He was never going to be lost again. The first thing he did when he reached the city was disappear into a thrift store, swapping out his smoke-stained clothes for something that made him blend in. A clean pair of jeans, a jacket with no holes, a simple shirt that didn't smell like ash and fear. He used the gold sparingly, exchanging small pieces at pawn shops, avoiding attention. It wouldn't last forever, but it would last long enough. Long enough for him to figure out who he was going to be now. The answer came unexpectedly in the quiet of the public library. He had started going there out of necessity. It was warm, no one asked questions, and as long as he kept his head down, he could stay as long as he wanted. But what began as a place of refuge quickly became something else. A book left open on a table caught his eye. A blueprint, a design for a bridge. The precise lines, the calculations, the way something could be built from nothing but an idea and the right knowledge. Eli had spent his childhood building things with his hands, fixing the cabin's broken beams, learning the structure of the forest itself. But this was different. This was creation. Something stirred inside him. Over the next few months, he devoured every book he could find on engineering, architecture, structural design. The concepts came naturally, as if his mind had been waiting for something to make sense. He sketched constantly, filling notebooks with ideas, calculations, models of buildings and bridges he might never see. And then one day he saw a flyer tacked to a bulletin board. City College Scholarship Program, full ride for civil engineering students. It felt like a door unlocking. For the first time since escaping the fire, he had a plan. Determination became his fuel. He worked harder than anyone around him, studying late into the night, taking jobs under the table to cover what the scholarship didn't. He kept his past buried, his name erased, but his focus was razor sharp. By the time he was 20, he was working internships at top firms. By 22, he was being noticed. Professors called him a natural. Companies offered him contracts before he had even graduated. But he didn't want to work for someone else. By 24, he built his own company from the ground up, a firm specializing in innovative building designs, structures that seemed impossible but weren't. He understood the science, the balance of weight and resistance, the way things were meant to stand strong, no matter the pressure. And maybe in some way, it was his way of rewriting his past. His father had tried to bury him, to burn him, to erase him, but now he was the one building something permanent. The past never truly disappears. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the spaces between success and solitude, in the reflection of a man who has built everything, yet still feels the weight of what he left behind. Eli had spent a decade erasing Ethan Carter, shedding the name, the scars, the memory of the fire that should have killed him. He had created a new life from the ashes, a man respected, admired. His company was thriving, his designs sought after, his name, his new name, whispered among the elite of the industry. And yet the past remained. It crept into his dreams, turning skyscrapers into burning cabins, making the walls around him feel too close, too flammable. It echoed in his mind when he stared out over a city skyline, his success a monument to survival, but not to closure, because James Carter was still out there. Eli hadn't spoken his father's name in years, hadn't dared to search for him, but the questions never left. Was he still in Montana? Had he killed again? Had he found another place to hide his secrets? Or had the past destroyed him the way he had tried to destroy his own son? Eli had the power now, resources, connections. Answers were no longer out of reach. So one morning, without hesitation, he picked up his phone and made a call. Find him. The private investigator didn't ask questions. Eli didn't give explanations. Within weeks, he had a report in his hands. James Carter was alive, but barely. The man who had once towered over Ethan in the wilderness, who had been as unshakable as the mountains, was now a ghost of himself. He had drifted from place to place, moving through backwater towns and rundown motels, his life shrinking year by year. There were records of odd jobs, failed attempts to start over, whispers of paranoia. For years, he had lived in constant fear. Fear of being caught, fear of the past resurfacing, fear that someone would come for what he had stolen. But the greatest irony, the gold he had been so desperate to protect, the gold he had been willing to kill his own son for, was gone. Eli had taken it the night he escaped. His father had destroyed everything for something he would never get back. Eli sat in his office, the file spread before him, staring at the last known photo of James Carter. A frail man, skin sunken, hair thinned, eyes hollowed out by years of waiting for a reckoning that had never come, until now. James Carter had spent years running, years looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with him. Now it finally had. Eli sat in the dim light of his office, the weight of the past pressing against him as he stared at the folder on his desk. Inside it was everything: police reports, forensic evidence from the burned cabin, witness statements from the few people who had ever interacted with James Carter after that night. It had taken time, patience, and the right people to dig it all up. But the story was undeniable. The man had tried to kill his own son, and now justice was waiting. It had started with a single call, a quiet conversation with an old contact, a lawyer whose career Eli had helped launch. No questions were asked, just quiet efficiency. The next step was law enforcement, getting the authorities to look at a case that had been buried under a decade of silence. The fire had been ruled an accident back then, nothing more than a remote cabin consumed by flames, leaving no one behind to dispute it. No body had ever been found. No crime had ever been filed. But now Ethan Carter was back from the dead, With new evidence in hand, the case was reopened. Investigators moved quickly, connecting the dots, tracing James Carter's steps, and when the time was right, they moved in. Eli wasn't there when they arrested him, but he saw the footage. James Carter, once an unshakable force of nature, was now a frail, gaunt man, his shoulders hunched, his hair thinned, his eyes darting in panic as officers surrounded him outside the dingy motel where he had been staying. His hands shook as they snapped the cuffs around his wrists, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to protest, but no words came. He had spent a decade fearing this moment, and now it was here. The courtroom was silent when James was brought in. The man who had once loomed over Ethan in the wilderness now looked small, his frame swallowed by the ill-fitting prison jumpsuit, his hands trembling slightly as they rested in his lap. But it wasn't until he looked up that Eli saw it. Recognition. Shock. Fear. James Carter's sunken eyes locked onto him, widening as if he were seeing a ghost. His breath caught, his shoulders tensed, and for the first time in his life, he looked afraid. Eli held his gaze, his expression unreadable. James had burned the past, tried to erase it, bury it under the weight of his own sins. But the past had survived. The trial was swift. The evidence was undeniable. The witnesses spoke of a man who had been paranoid for years, haunted by something no one understood. The forensic reports confirmed what Eli already knew. The fire had been intentional, the doors had been sealed, the match had been struck with intent to kill. The verdict was read aloud, each word striking like a hammer. Guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. James Carter barely reacted, his face blank, his body slumped, as if the weight of his own crimes had finally crushed him. Then came the sentence. Life in prison. Eli didn't smile, didn't feel triumph. He only felt the weight of finality. James Carter was no longer the man who had once haunted his nightmares. He was no longer a monster lurking in the shadows. He was just a man. And now, the past could finally stay where it belonged. The heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind him, sealing away the past with a final, resounding click. Eli stepped onto the courthouse steps, inhaling deeply, feeling the sharp bite of the crisp autumn air. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't haunted by the weight of a name that no longer belonged to him. James Carter was gone, locked away, powerless, irrelevant. But Eli, he was still here. He let out a slow breath, his hands resting in his coat pockets as he watched people move past him. Lawyers, reporters, strangers who would never know the truth of what had led him to this moment. They would only see a successful man, walking free, carrying himself with quiet confidence. They would never know that he had once been a boy trapped in a burning house, screaming for help that would never come. That was the thing about survival. No one could see the scars unless you showed them. But instead of letting his scars define him, Eli had built something out of them. At first, he hadn't known what to do with his second chance. Success had come swiftly. His company had flourished, his designs shaping city skylines, his wealth growing beyond what he ever could have imagined. But no amount of glass towers or steel bridges could erase the memories of the past. The nights spent alone in shelters, the hunger, the uncertainty, the fear. There were other kids out there who knew that same fear. Children left behind, children who had no one. And for them, Eli decided to build something greater. He poured his fortune into funding shelters, creating outreach programs, offering scholarships to kids who had been told, like he once had, that they were nothing. He didn't want their past to dictate their futures. He wanted them to see what was possible. The headlines came quickly. Mysterious young CEO donates millions to youth programs. Eli Carter, the architect of second chances. People asked why he cared so much, why his generosity seemed so personal. Eli never answered, because it wasn't about him. It was about the boy who never should have survived. One evening, long after the trial had faded into news archives, Eli found himself standing by the ocean, watching the waves roll in under the golden glow of the setting sun. For years, he had been moving forward, always forward, as if stopping meant the past would catch up to him. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to be still. The wind carried the scent of salt and freedom. the endless horizon stretching before him. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the waves fill the silence where fear used to live. He had been a victim once, but now he was something more. Some stories are about survival, others are about transformation. Eli Carter's story was both. He didn't just escape a burning cabin, he escaped a fate that had been decided for him. He was supposed to die that night, another nameless tragedy buried under ashes. But instead he became something more than his past, something greater than the pain inflicted upon him. That is the power of choice. We don't always get to decide where we come from. Some of us are born into hardship, into broken families, into circumstances designed to keep us small. But our past is only the prologue, never the whole story. Eli could have let the fire define him. He could have lived his life trapped in anger, in revenge, in the need to prove something to the man who tried to erase him. Instead, he chose to build, to create, to rewrite his fate with his own hands. And that is the greatest truth of all. Your past may shape you, but it does not own you. No matter how impossible it seems, you can rise. You can build. You can become something no one ever saw coming. Now I turn this question to you. What's your story? What moments shaped you? What challenges did you face that once seemed insurmountable? How did you rise? Your story matters. And if you're still in the middle of it, if you're still searching for your escape, know this: there is always another chapter waiting to be written. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. If you believe in the power of resilience, in turning pain into purpose, join us. Hit that subscribe button, because this is more than just a story. This is a community of survivors, of dreamers, of those who refuse to be defined by their past. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in what comes next.